I'm Kevin Boyle. I'm the Climate Change Initiatives Coordinator with the District Muskoka. And we're very proud to be partnering with the Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center, along with our other partner organizations on this speaker series. We've got some really exciting discussions planned, but maybe we'll just start with a little bit of logistics. As you'll see in the bottom of your screen, beside your chat box, there's a little Q&A box. That's basically our function for asking questions. Now, with that being said, be sure that when you put a question in the question and answer box, you just have a quick read of what questions are there, because it gives you the ability on the left-hand side to like or thumbs up or vote for a question. And that way we get less duplication, but also we can see, what questions really resonate with people that they really want the answers to. So we're going to go through all the presentations. So we've got Aaron Rusak first and Dr. Ellen Field second, and then we'll do a moderated question at the end where I'll sort of try to balance the questions back and forth between Aaron and Dr. Field. But to start with, I'm excited to introduce Aaron Rusak, who is the Land Stewardship Coordinator with the Muskoka Conservancy and is an avid naturalist. He spends much of his time outside watching birds and photographing insects, and is a certified wetland evaluator and Ontario Master Naturalist, and enjoys learning as much as he can about the natural world. I know I'm always pleased when I see one of his articles in our local paper coming out, and I get a lot of information from that. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Aaron Rusak and his presentation. Thanks very much. Over to you, Aaron.
Okay, so let me just get my PowerPoint set up, and hopefully this will look correct. Is that correct? You can see my presentation. Okay.
Swap. You just gotta swap the note. Yeah, awesome.
Okay, perfect. So that should be good now. So my talk today is on protecting terrestrial spaces and the work that the Conservancy does to do this. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about the Conservancy, just so everyone has a good understanding of what we do before getting into how important our work is. Just because when I started at Muskoka Conservancy, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I had no idea what a land trust was, or had very little idea what a land trust was. And I've talked to a number of other people in my field who have the same experience. So understanding what we do will help kind of frame the discussion, the talk that I'm giving today. So Muskoka Conservancy is a Muskoka-based land trust, and land trusts protect properties or acres in their natural state. So we protect almost 3,000 acres now. I think we're at like 2,950 or somewhere abouts there. And this spans across 44 different properties. Most of our properties are in Muskoka. We have, I think, one in Simcoe County, and then we also have a couple up in Parry Sound as well. And these properties provide habitat for 21 species at risk, 21 different species at risk that we know of. And the interesting thing about my job is I get to be the one that finds the 22nd species at risk on our property. And I'm sure there's more than 21, but those are the ones that are currently identified. And Kevin already kind of went through me. I'll just do a quick recap. I'm an avid naturalist and birder. Some call me obsessed. I like avid, it sounds nicer. I spend I've woken up at 5 o'clock every single day for the last 2 weeks to go look at birds before I start work. So that might give you a sense of how avid I am. I'm the regional coordinator for the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program, as well as the Breeding Bird Atlas of Ontario, and I'm a certified wetland evaluator. It's a combination of all these skills that helps me kind of do the species surveys, identify stuff on our properties, and figure out how to manage our properties in the best way possible. So my role as a land stewardship coordinator is a lot of monitoring and management of properties. So what is a land trust? And I'm guessing that some people already know this answer. But I'm guessing there's probably some people who have maybe a hazy understanding or no understanding at all, which is totally fine because, as I said, I had no idea. So most land trusts are nonprofit charitable organizations. I think almost all of them are. There might be a couple out there that haven't made it to charitable status yet, but their goal and their mission is to protect land or donated land in its natural state. And so of those 29, 2,900 acres that we protect, more than 50% of that is donated land. So people donated the land to us and received a charitable tax receipt for it. And we now own and protect that land in the current state. Some of them are, so that's our donated land. We also have conservation easements or agreements over some of the properties where the landowner maintains private ownership of the property, but essentially designates, a portion of the property to be a protected area. Some it's 66%, some it's 75%, some I think are almost 100% protected area. And what that does is allows them to maintain ownership, and like if it's a cottage lot, they can, they still have their cottage, but they're able to protect the ecologically sensitive portions of their land. And that's registered to title. So it actually transfers, if a new owner comes, it will transfer with it. So that it maintains that protected land regardless of who is owning that property. Our operations are totally funded by donors. We do apply for some grants, but the majority of our funding comes from donors, from our members, from our supporters. And our whole mission is to protect that land for perpetuity, for forever. So the funding is a pretty key portion of making sure our land is protected. And that's kind of how most land trusts operate. They operate some form of that. So by the numbers, I've already given you a couple of these numbers, our 44 properties protected and that 2,950-ish acres. But we also divided up based off some of the ecosystem types, some of the more sensitive one. So we additionally protect over 500 acres of wetland and 51,000 feet of shoreline. And most of that shoreline feet are on the big lakes. So Lake Muskoka, Lake Joseph. And the important thing about these numbers is it kind of gives you a breakdown of, it's about 500 acres of wetland, a bit over 500 acres, and, 2,400 acres of, other habitats, so rock barrens, upland forests, things like that. So we're not just protecting a specific portion. We're protecting, a large tracts of land for various types of species. And I mean, there are some provincial and national parks that probably are bigger than all the land we protect, but we do play a very key role in that land conservation. And the start of my talk is going to talk about that role that we play and why it's important. So I took this from the MNRF Crowned Land Atlas map, and this is the crowned land, provincial parks and conservation reserves that are managed by the government. So this is just Gravenhurst and Bracebridge. It's not all of Muskoka, but this gives a sense of kind of what is protected in Muskoka already. So it doesn't include any of the properties that we protect. And I'm going to show a couple things that are important in the work that we do. So we have this kind of, light green color here. This one is QEW2 wildlands. And then up here, we've got Hardy Lake Provincial Park. So those are our provincial and national parks are in that color. These, I don't know how to describe this, olive green maybe. These are conservation reserves. So this is the Cashy Barrens Conservation Reserve. This is Silver Lake and Jevons. We got Muldrew, Loon Lake, and Torrance Barrens. And then this beige color here, that's the Crown land. So it kind of has a variety of, each has different amounts of protection on it. So, national provincial parks have the most protection. Conservation reserve have a slightly reduced, and then crown land has more reduced from that. And now all of these, or in the large majority of these, there's no development allowed. So it is protecting habitat in a natural state. And I'm just going to clear those. And what we do is we add to that. So this is our properties, approximations of our properties. They're not exact. They're not all our properties are squares. So I've put kind of a whereabouts our properties are to help illustrate what exactly we do. So it becomes really interesting when you look at a map like this, because when you just look at our properties on a single map without any other knowledge, it's not quite as impressive as when you look at it this way. Because when you look at it this way, you can start to see what our properties do. They create linkages where there weren't linkages before. So we have this crown land up here linked down to this conservation reserve because of this single property. We're creating corridors, and hopefully, you know, will in the future have a more significant corridor. But all of a sudden, with our properties, we start having a corridor into Muldrew Lake Barrens there. We have a corridor across Lake Muskoka potentially, where things can move, especially when we're talking about birds. Migrating birds are everywhere right now. So we're creating these corridors that connect protected areas with other protected areas. Not only do we protect these properties and provide habitat, which I'll talk about later, but we're also, you know, adding a continuous connection between the various types of protected land. And that's really important when we're talking about migration, but it's also important when we're talking about just species ranges. Some species require 100 acres, some require 10 acres. And having continuous and large tracts of lands that aren't going to get developed is very important in doing that. And then I'm going to take it just a step further and look at, these are all the land trusts in Ontario. So OLTA is the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, and it's kind of a group of land trusts in Ontario. So you can see all the different colors are different land trusts. And if there was only one land trust in Muskoka, we would probably have some issues, but we have land trusts across Ontario. And what the land trusts across Ontario do is they add to whatever corridors we're creating. So Couchiching, which is just south of us in the Orillia area here, they protect properties that are, you know, within probably about 10 kilometers of some of our properties or closer. I think they have ones that are almost adjacent. So they're protecting properties in Orillia and Barrie in the Simcoe area. We're protecting ones in Muskoka, and we're creating linkages across counties even just through these land trusts, you know, all protecting different properties. So when you start looking at the kind of bigger scale, it becomes a lot more impressive as to what exactly land trusts and what the Conservancy is doing. And there aren't any land trusts up way north because there's a lot less settlement there, a lot less development. If development increases in the area, we might see a land trust start forming. But at the moment, just around Lake Superior and a few of the other land trusts up there. But the large portions of the Boreal are, for the most part, still fairly low on development pressures. So what I was talking about, providing those corridors, our properties connect those protected lands, and they provide natural corridors for species to move. So everyone's kind of seen the corridors that go underneath the highway, which are really key in protecting, you know, turtles and snakes and things like that. But our properties provide a natural corridor where they don't need to travel underneath a highway to get to the next section of, you know, undeveloped land. They can just use our property in between. The other thing we do is also protect those shoreline corridors. So when you're looking at some, really sensitive species like loons, which are currently not a species at risk, but there is a potential chance of them becoming one in the future, as is probably the case for a number of different species. We protect those shoreline corridors that they use to either migrate north, or loons also have two separate habitats they use on the lake. They have a breeding and a nursery habitat. So protecting those shoreline areas is also key for those waterfowl, for some of the large mammals who use them to move larger distances. So corridors are probably one of the most impactful thing that will come. Probably it'll take a little bit of time, because obviously some of those corridors that I showed you aren't there yet. They're just starting to get there. But hopefully in 5-10 years, we'll continue adding to that, and we'll have a really significant corridor. And in some cases, we already do have a very significant corridor for species to move. The other thing in this kind of holistic approach to conservation is protection of wetlands. So the interesting thing about how we protect land is someone will donate potentially a 100-acre parcel to us. We don't accept every parcel. There are some restrictions. We like to have some species at risk on there before, or identify some really sensitive ecosystems. But when we get a 100-acre parcel, it's not just a 100-acre wetland or a 100-acre forest or a 100-acre rock barren. We have that variety of wetland or variety of habitats. So sometimes when we protect an upland forest, we also get 15 acres of wetland. And wetlands are becoming, and I mean, I hope they're becoming a bigger point for people, because in the past, especially potentially in Muskoka, wetlands have kind of been, a place where you just put some fill so that you can build there. But wetlands are hugely significant. There's a number of different things that you can do. I'll touch on these just a little bit. Flood mitigation is probably near and dear to almost everyone's heart after the flood, I believe it was 2 years ago, which was quite significant. And I can tell you, I went out to one of our properties in that flood, one that has a river system that goes into Skeleton Lake. And I honestly did not see too much of a change. I didn't see much flooding, let's put it that way. I didn't see, there was a change in water level, but it's not like the whole property was flooded. And that was because the wetland was there to mitigate some of those effects of flooding. So all the water crashing through had a place to go. Wetlands give water a place to go. They have plants that are tolerant to these, extremely significant rain events or water events, and they can help prevent large-scale flooding. So they hold water and release it slowly, as opposed to if we just tarmacked the wetland, all that water still has to go somewhere. It doesn't get to sit like it would in a wetland. It has to go somewhere, and it's all going to go somewhere at once. Whereas wetlands stop that. They collect the water and slowly move it downstream. So they're also very key habitat for species at risk. Our turtles are like almost solely wetland dwellers. Many of our turtles utilize wetlands. Our blandings are spotted, painted, snapping. We have several species of breeding birds that use wetlands either for breeding or for feeding. All our swallow species use wetlands for feeding, and a large number of warblers will breed in wetlands. So they're very important for a number of different species, and they're not, we have lots of forest. We do have lots of wetland, but forest is a little bit easier to create than wetland. Once you fill in a wetland, it's a lot harder to fix. Whereas if you chop down a forest, you can plant some more trees. It'll take some time, but it's a little bit easier to replace. The carbon sink point is more for northern Muskoka. Peat moss is a huge carbon sink. So when we get those peatlands that we see further north, those huge bogs in the north, those are very important for collecting carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. We're lucky in Ontario where our peatlands are relatively unaffected, I want to say, with some amount of caution, but in other areas they're getting mined, peat is getting ripped out, and that all that carbon, when you burn it or when you use it, goes back into the atmosphere. So our bogs and some of our fens are very useful in sucking in that carbon and using it for, storing it in the peat moss. And then another point, I love wetlands, so I could talk about wetlands all day, but there's a lot of kind of interesting nutrient storage that wetlands do, which we don't think when it comes to things like algal blooms. So algal blooms are caused, and I'm not a huge master on algal blooms, but reduced nutrients to algal blooms reduces the potential of an algal bloom. They need some amount of nutrients to be able to establish themselves. And what wetlands do is they actually let nutrients settle out of the water system and help purify the water. So wetlands can be very useful in that wetland storage and preventing some of those algal blooms. Now, there's probably a little bit more work that needs to be done to see exactly how much and how important that is. But they're definitely filtering that nutrients. More nutrients in the wetlands means less nutrients in the lakes. The other kind of side of the coin to wetlands are vernal pools, and they do have many of the similar benefits of wetlands, not quite as extensive because they're only seasonally flooded depressions. So they're not there all year like many wetlands. They're basically, you'll see them in early spring and late fall, and they're critical habitat for species or for breeding amphibians. You'll see wood frogs using them. I found salamander eggs in several of the vernal pools I visited this year. And the reason for that is there aren't any predators in them. It's a seasonal depression. There aren't fish. There's nothing that has established themselves because the water doesn't last long enough. So they're really key in that breeding amphibians. We have chorus frogs that are a species at risk that utilize vernal pools. All of our salamanders pretty much do. And those aren't included in any of these like development mapping for wetlands. They're just a pool of water that no one really knows exist. And the benefit of that 100 acres I talked about is we have vernal pools on almost every property, whether we know it or not. And we're protecting those without specifically protecting those. Yeah, and then species at risk habitat. Wetlands are big for species at risk. I talked about that one, but rock barrens like the Kashi Barrens Conservation Reserve are hugely important for some real at-risk species, whippoorwills being probably one of the more notable ones. But species at risk need a variety of habitats. You can't just protect one type to protect the species. They habitats they migrate through. They have breeding habitats. If they're loons, they have nursery habitats where they raise their young. And some of these habitats are very niche. Some are more generalists. So we need to be looking at the entire life cycle of an animal to be protecting that species. So when we know that we have bobolinks on a property and we protect a property for bobolinks and we're protecting that 100 acres, we may not know that they need to go into the forest for a little bit. Most of our bird species are a little bit more well studied, but when we're looking at dragonflies and butterflies, we don't entirely know their entire life cycle. So protecting not just where they're found breeding is very key for making sure they're coming back and they have the suitable habitat that's required. Not all of our properties are 100 acres. Some of them are smaller. We have some 10-acre ones. I think we have a few like 2-acre ones. But even these small spaces can have a really big impact. So the bobolink that I was talking about, it's pictured right there. Its territory is about 1.2 hectares, which is, I believe, something like 4 acres. So it requires for breeding a very small protected area. Now, the habitat, the feeding area that it needs is larger, 5 to 50 hectares. But those small territories that we can protect, it can feed over, meadows. It can probably feed a little bit in the forest. But protecting even just that breeding area is important as well. So our protected areas, are making a big impact on not only the species at risk feeding areas and breeding areas, but also those migrating areas, anywhere they're raising young, things like that. So small spaces, even those 10-acre properties, are really important because that might be one of the few places that that species breeds. And to highlight that, I have just 2 photos. And I kind of, the reason I don't have any text is because I didn't really know what to put, and which is kind of a good thing with these species. The left species is an amber-winged spreadwing, a species of damselfly, and the right species is an ebony bog hunter, a species of dragonfly. And both these species have 100 or less breeding populations in Ontario, which you would think qualifies them to be a species at risk, but neither of them are a species at risk. These photos were both taken at our properties and kind of speaks to the long-term potential that the Conservancy can also provide, in that I don't know if these species are going to be species at risk in the future. I don't know if climate change is going to wipe out every single habitat they have except for the 2 or 3 properties that we protect them on. We don't know everything that's going to happen in the future. But what the Conservancy can do, and what it does do, is it protects these habitats before they need to be protected. We don't need to scramble to find ebony bog haunters or amber-winged spreadwings. We already know where a few of them are, and we're already protecting that habitat. So when we're talking about climate change mitigation and adaptation, the Conservancy is, I would like to think, almost one step ahead of it, because we don't know what's going to be a species at risk in 10 years, but we might already be protecting the habitat for. And the ebony bog haunter, at least, is a very not well-known dragonfly, and it's not clear exactly what they need. But the property that it's located on that I found last year is 75 acres. And I really hope that in that 75 acres, a small dragonfly can find everything it needs. If it can't, then maybe we're in bigger trouble. But I like to think of us as short-term and long-term solutions to things, and that looking into the future, we're going to be protecting things that we don't even need to be protected, that we don't even know need to be protected right now. So kind of to wrap that all up, like I said, that short and long-term benefits. In the short, we're protecting habitat for species we know now. We're protecting those ecosystems that are really important to those species. But we're also looking to the future and saying, every year we're monitoring these properties. We know what's on these properties, or we know many species that are on these properties. And if they become a species at risk in the future, then we'll already have it protected. There isn't any scrambling for us to be doing. And a good example of that is painted turtle. Painted turtle just became a species at risk about 1.5 years ago. Before, they were just the painted turtle, and now they're species of special concern. And maybe 5 years from now, they're going to be threatened. And hopefully we have them on, probably 10 or more of our properties. Hopefully they can stay there and they'll be able to use that for many years in the future. So that ability to kind of the Conservancy isn't going to be able to stop climate change. I mean, we can help mitigate and adapt to it. We can give those species room to change their habits if they need, or give those species a buffer from, development or other things that might be occurring. And I think I'm going to end it there, hopefully on a relatively good note.
That is really great. That's a lot of information, Aaron, and you guys do such a critical job. Wetlands, protecting wetlands, leading to flooding, but I think it resonates with the Muskoka Watershed Council and the talk about fragmentation. You guys building those corridors being so key. But I think one of the things that you said there that really struck with me, which is protecting things now we don't even need. That we don't even know that we'll need to protect later. I think that's really great. So thank you very much, Aaron, for your talk tonight. And we'll hold all the questions to the end, but just to keep us on track, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ellen Field, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University. Her research focuses on policy and practice of climate change in education from the K-12 system. her postdoc was a national review of climate change education in Canada, an investigation into the practices around climate change, a comprehensive survey of Canadian teachers. And she did this by engaging various stakeholders, students, parents, members of the general public, about their perspectives on climate change in education and schooling. She teaches environmental education and climate change education, excuse me, and has facilitated professional development workshops with over 800 students across Canada the last several years. And I know that I've been had the pleasure of being in her classroom and seeing how much the students learn from her. So I'm excited to present to you Dr. Ellen Field and her talk. Over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Kevin. Excuse me. So let me get my slide set up. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, Ellen, we can see it okay. It's a little narrow, but
here, let me just do this then. I'll play with my desktop. Is that a little better?
That's getting better. That's great.
Okay, great.
Oh yeah, there you go. That's perfect. Excellent.
Thank you. So thanks for everyone for being here on this first sunny day of many rainy days and attending our talks. So my talk this evening is called Education, Social Norms, and Research-Informed Climate Change Engagement. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on the lands from which we all gather virtually today on Turtle Island, and thank past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And today I'm in Orillia, so a little bit south of where probably many of you are, which is the Williams Treaty Territory and is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. And the Anishinaabe include the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. And I'll just sort of put this forward that if the land was governed today according to Anishinaabe law, we would not be having a discussion today about the climate crisis, something I think we can think about. So in my talk, I hope to make the case that climate science education is not enough, to provide some context on how cultural cognition, identity politics, and social learning processes are all important for us to consider how we communicate about climate change, and also to different audiences. And the last part, I will share some insights from the national survey that Kevin spoke to in the bio that I was a lead investigator on, and about how we can improve some of those gaps that my study found. And sort of riffing back to Aaron's talk, for me, I think education may be akin to sort of wetlands in the social and cultural climate fight that we are currently in. So we need to really think about the ways that education is a mitigation strategy and not just sort of see it as a sort of messy uncertainty that we don't know how to measure. So first, let's just take a moment to reflect on the fact that Dr. James Hansen said in 1988 to a US Congressional Committee that it was 99% certain that the warming trend was not a natural variation, but was caused by a buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that was 33 years ago, and he started collecting the data in 1981. So we can actually say it's been about 40 years of data collection and strong science. So we're now in 2021 and have had since 2014 when the IPCC came out with its scientific consensus on human-caused climate change. So the science is clear. We don't need more of the same approaches to climate science education to improve things. In fact, we're now seeing scientists sort of escalate their statements and veer away from the domains that they're normally sort of studying and start putting forward ideas on how to move society towards addressing what has been so clear within the sciences. And quite frankly, they're starting to sound quite exasperated. I mean, I think they've been exasperated for probably 20 years. Here's a quote, Jim Skia, the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group on Mitigation, when the 2018 report came out, in a press release, in an interview, he said, "We've pointed out the enormous benefits of keeping to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and also the unprecedented shift in energy systems and transport that would be needed to achieve that. We show it can be done within the laws of physics and chemistry. Then the final tick box is political will. We cannot answer that. Only our audience can, and that is the governments that receive it. So the science is clear. Scientists have done their job, and they'll continue to monitor, model, and predict. And here I would like us to pivot to some important aspects of social science research that have helped us understand why we seem to be so slow in our ability to change our human systems. So first, mainstream media predominantly uses a doomsday narrative framing to report on climate change news and focuses on problem identification. So when it comes to climate change, many people develop defense mechanisms, right? They've had busy lives, busy days, hustle and bustle all day. They sit down to watch the news, and then they're inundated with these types of doomsday narratives. So the defense mechanisms set in, and this occurs to manage the psychological tension they experience as they come to learn about the slow-moving emergency threatening us and our planet's quality of life. And this emotional existential anxiety is met with denial, distraction, or exhaustion. And what I think we need to do better socially is to acknowledge that this is a normal psychological response. It's very normal to feel overwhelmed by this type of framing, as well as the existential threat that climate change poses to us in beyond the narrative framing. So I'll just sort of mention two books that I think are really quite important and pivotal in bringing forward some new ideas around this area. And Ellen Kelsey's new book, Hope Matters, Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis, develops a nuanced argument about media framing, focusing on problem identification that I just discussed, and a starting line fallacy. So that is that it makes it seem that nothing has been accomplished. Her argument is that change is happening, and that to have active hope is not to engage in wishful thinking, but a mindset that attends to the realities of what is at stake, and then a grit to work towards changing it. And so while I'm on this sort of book promotion slide, I'll also suggest, if you haven't read it, The Future We Choose by Christina Figueres, who was the UN Executive Secretary for Climate Change during the Paris Agreement. And it's also co-authored by Tom Rivett-Carnac. And they also have an amazing podcast that I'd also highly recommend. And in this book, they project two different future scenarios, one with unmitigated runaway climate change, what 2050 would look like, and the other in a transformed society. And so it's this place of where often our future narratives are bereft of these future possibilities. And so this book, I find, puts into the public consciousness that mindset and that opportunity. So in juxtaposition to this, I'll just sort of quickly speak to this, but in general, motivating people to do things through using fear imaging doesn't work over the long term or to engage mass amounts of people. And I know my slide's a little fuzzy, but it comes from a study that's titled Fear Won't Do It, Promoting Positive Engagement with Climate Change Through Visual and Iconic Representations. And in this study, the researchers showed photos to people to see which photos made participants feel strongly or very strongly that climate change is important. So first the participants had to rank it on that. And then secondly, they asked participants which photos made them feel that they could do something about climate change. And the images that made people feel strongly that climate change is most important, such as starving children, dried up lakes with dead fish, or smokestacks, are often the same images that make participants feel unable to do anything about it. So this type of research led Climate Outreach, which is George Marshall in the UK's organization, to develop Climate Visuals, which is an image database that aligns with tested effective communication frames for engagement. So from social science research, we've also learned that climate change facts are subject to cultural cognition. And that is, we automatically look for information that confirms what we already think, want, or feel. So people generally, or people exhibit a strong selection preference for information on climate change that already matches and reinforces their cultural identity and worldview. So we've seen the rise of disinformation spread throughout social media. And along with this, there is often similar positionality on things such as wearing masks, vaccinations. And so we have, you can see how cultural identities and politics start to play in to the ways that we actually digest information and our positionality on certain topics. So here you have a data visualization of Twitter audiences that are talking about climate change. And again, it's probably a little hard for you to see on Zoom. And part of what we have to deal with from an educational standpoint is many people do get information from social media. Many people get it also their climate change information, mostly from news and documentaries. But how do we find ways for, I'll just pick some groups, the Detroit teens who love rap, so that's one of the audiences that was identified, with Americans who support the resistance, along with moms who support the Democratic Party. So how do we have these discussions across our cultural and political divides? So, and it's an absolute necessity. And why it's a necessity, because right now we're starting to see the Biden and Harris administration making large pro-climate policy moves without addressing the deep political and cultural divide that is still in the US. And so with these moves being brought through executive orders, who's to say how long they will last? And if there is an incoming president with a different agenda that can easily take that action away. And so this is why David Wallace Wells, in his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which is another great book that I will promote, argues for a transformed politics as a necessary action for us to be able to actually deal with climate change. And I would actually say beyond a transformed politics, the underpinnings are beyond politics. It is a cultural transformation that is needed in order for us to actually deal with transforming the political system. So let's just draw back a little bit and I'll just highlight a few other pieces that social science research has really sort of given us in terms of how we can better understand how to communicate around climate change. So the Yale program on climate change communication has been doing fascinating research for 10 years to really crack this nut. And they've identified 6 different audiences that respond to climate change messaging in different ways. And then researchers in Canada use a lot of the questions and the frameworks, and then have developed a very robust data set for how we can understand climate change understanding in Canada. So that's mostly Dr. Eric Lachapelle and Louise Comeau, who have led this. And so they apply these different audiences to a Canadian context and identified not 6 audiences in the US data set, but 4 in Canada. So these audiences are the dismissive, and as the word sort of connotes, they fail to acknowledge that climate change is happening. And then you have the skeptics. So they don't attribute humans as the cause to climate change, or they may also be maybe not sure that it's completely happening, but they're not firmly against that it's happening. And then the aware understand that climate change is happening, but they don't think that any actions will make a difference in terms of the outcome. And then the last group are the empowered. And so they both understand that climate change is happening, but they also believe that there is an ability for us to enact change through various measures. So this, and I realize this is also really hard to read. And so this data in particular, when we look at the sociodemographics, is it's a little bit dated. It's from 2017. But from other recent polling that I've seen, and also the survey research I've seen, some of this can be is consistent. So when you look at the distribution of these segments across sociodemographic characteristics, you can see some really interesting variation. So for instance, women, so you can see here, female, tend to rank higher on the ladder of engagement. In fact, 1 in 3 Canadian women are considered empowered compared to less than 1 man in 4. The higher educated, so those who have at least 1 university degree, are more empowered compared to those who have less than 1 university degree. Another group that I will draw your attention to are young people, so 18 to 34-year-olds are by far the most aware group for this. And they're the least represented among the skeptics. So this research has helped a lot of NGOs. They work directly with NGOs to help inform their communication policies, to direct what they have to share. As well, this slide from EcoAnalytics shows how the acceptance of climate change shifts within different political groups and suggests the politicization of the issue, specifically in the progressive conservative group, based on the members of that group and their attribution of the belief in anthropogenic climate change. So this is very interesting in terms of how we generally think about knowledge and research, and then the hopes of how that may be used by people. But it really begs a question about how do we educate more effectively, and what are the ways that communication can help us. So I'm going to highlight a few findings from my SSHRC-funded postdoc, which resulted in this national survey. And it was conducted in collaboration with an NGO called Learning for a Sustainable Future, as well as Leger Research Intelligence. And the research is a comprehensive mixed method survey that provides baselines on Canadians' perceptions of climate change and its risks. It also assesses Canadians' knowledge and understanding on climate change. And then a whole section on education. So it looks at how Canadians think school systems are responding. And then we did a whole other section on in-depth in terms of teachers and students, looking at what is actually happening in schools. And some of this data is unprecedented for Canada, especially from youth. So we asked youth grades 7 to 12. And as you maybe saw in the previous one, youth was considered 18 to 34, where we're looking at a much younger grouping. So there were just over 3,000 respondents, and we had target audiences of the general public. So it was just over 1,000 members of the general public. There was just around 500 parents in the study. There was around 500 youth, and educators was around 1,200. And it was in both English and French. So I'll just give you a few insights in terms of what that survey found. So Canadians are concerned about climate change. It was clear. Canadians are certain that climate change is happening and that it's human caused for the most part. And this is in line with other polling research besides EcoAnalytics, but Abacus Data has done more recent stuff as well as Leger, and this is all in line. However, there is gaps in Canadians' knowledge and understanding, with only 48% of Canadians correctly attributing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as the primary causes of climate change. So that's a big gap. And in addition, 42% of Canadians identified that they were unsure how much heating the Earth system can tolerate. So this question was actually like, can the Earth system tolerate 1 degree of warming, 1.5 degree of warming, 2 degrees, up to 5 degrees, 6 degrees, or don't know? And so in that question, 42% of Canadians identified that they didn't know how to answer that question. So these last 2 questions were 2 of 10 foundational climate knowledge questions that were asked within the survey. And when we looked at how Canadians did over those 10 questions, 43% of Canadians failed what I would consider a fairly basic climate change knowledge test. So there are significant gaps between how well informed Canadians are or how they perceive, how we perceive how well informed we are and how well informed we actually are. So 51% of Canadians feel well informed, but only 14% answered 8 to 10 of those questions correctly. So there's a real opportunity here for public education, as 86% of Canadians agree they need more information on climate change. So when we asked which sources of information Canadians trust, as you would expect, and as lots of other research has shown, scientists and academics were high up there. However, where people get their information is from television news, documentaries, and this I'm going to come back to because it's important. 47% of people said with conversations with friends and family. Also interesting in terms of like a policy, if we're thinking about how to create a strong climate policy for Canada and where the Canadian public is at and what's going to resonate. I put these two up here because I think it's interesting that there is doubt that technology will save climate change. So about 70% of Canadians don't think that technology is going to solve our current crisis. As well, 57% of Canadians believe their actions have an impact on climate change, while just under 80% agree that while personal actions are important, systemic change is needed to address climate change. And so I think these both identify, along with the others on the wide acceptance that climate change is happening, a readiness for the Canadian public for strong climate policy. So I'll just quickly talk about formal education, and I don't know if folks here, if there are teachers, but overwhelmingly Canadians and educators agree that more should be done to educate young people about climate change. And in our research, we found that there's limited class time that is spent on climate change content in the school year, and it actually works out to 1 to 10 hours of instruction per year or semester. As well, we found that we shouldn't just blame teachers for this. Teachers need support. It's a complex topic as well as it's controversial in some areas. And so teachers need professional development to feel able and ready to teach this content, as well as classroom resources and different aspects, as well as accurate national and provincial climate data. But there's also a real sort of resonance that teachers feel that all teachers should be teaching about climate change, that it's not just science teachers' responsibility. And the last sort of insight I'm going to share is that students are a key group for us to target with climate change education and action. And this isn't just like a moral argument that I'm making, or that young people are going to be the most affected. It comes straight from the data. So 46% of students aged 12 to 18 are categorized as aware. So we took that ladder of engagement framework that I showed you, we applied it to young people. So this means that they understand that human-caused climate change is happening, but they do not believe that human efforts will be effective. And as a researcher, I had a moment where I just looked at that data and I put my head down on my computer, because I just thought, that's a burgeoning mental health crisis. How do we address that? Because what does it mean to understand that climate change is going to happen and that there's nothing you can do to change it, and you're a 12 to 18-year-old? So for me, I've actually adjusted my research agenda to hone in on this, because I think it is such an important area for us to think about. How can we have our education systems be more responsive to ensure that young people are learning about climate change, but also learning skills and capacities so they can enact change. So this is just the data broken down. And so you can see here, this 46% of young people, the largest group by far out of any of our segments in this in this aware category. And our teachers, we had 2 samples, and I won't go into the specifics on the methodology, but they were by far the most empowered. So that is great. We just need to translate this empowerment into these young people. So I just want to, I have a couple more last sort of pieces. And if you are a scientist and you do science communication, we really need to move away from this idea that we just give knowledge and then that's going to result in attitudinal change, which will then result in behavior change. And I know there's a lot of details on this slide. This is research out of the US in 2019, but with young people, that showed that the most important predictors of pro-climate behavior with young people is one, around social norms, so that they're surrounded by social norms where there is climate change acceptance. And the second is that they have a sense of efficacy, that they can create change and influence events around them. So maybe in terms of climate change education, we don't need to, we don't need to focus on the science, we need to focus on leadership skills and capacity building skills, because those are the predictors of youth climate behavior. And so I put this as well, this 47% of Canadians get information about climate change from friends and family. And so us as individuals, we can change our behaviors in terms of, reducing, flying less, or insulating our homes and all of those things. But one of the things we almost never think about is the fact that we can talk about what climate change means to us on a personal level with our family and friends, and that will have a massive ripple effect in society. I'll just highlight this as well. George Marshall, who runs climate outreach in the UK, published this opinion piece in The Guardian 2 days ago, and he's sort of putting forth this idea of we've had information campaigns on Brexit and COVID, so his audience is in the UK. So what about climate change? And he's really arguing that governments need to commit to sustained and informed engagement strategies with their citizens about the risk of climate change in order for citizens to truly understand the urgency, the complexity, and also what we need to do. If half of Canadians don't understand that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are causing climate change, then how can we expect them to vote for strong climate policies that will address those greenhouse gases? So lastly, I'll just like to also highlight that Canada, as a signatory of the Paris Agreement, agreed to Article 12, which is one of the pieces of the Paris Agreement that we constantly look over, which is that parties agreed to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information, recognizing the importance of these steps with respect to enhancing actions under the Paris Agreement. And sorry, I was reading verbatim from Article 12 there. So within Canada, we have had climate policies engage energy, agriculture, transportation. Those are typically the focus. We really haven't engaged our education sector. And this doesn't just have to be formal education. We really need what's called an Action for Climate Empowerment strategy that looks at how do we engage museums, NGOs, schools, news outlets, so that we have a robust education approach in Canada. So with that, I will say thanks and open it up for Q&A.
That is absolutely excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Field. And I know that I think you mentioned museums there, and well, we sort of have one right now with education. So I think there's a great link there. But I mean, I think it's really important things that you may never even realize, like with your climate change visualization, just how something's displayed is very important, right? It's sort of like also how Aaron mentioned, and I love this line, I'm going to steal your line, Aaron, but protecting things that we don't even know right now that we need to protect. And so, I mean, I think those were just two really fantastic talks. So maybe we'll turn it over to questions now, and I'll just sort of, I'll do back and forth with questions. We've got a number in there. So people, please just in the QA section, add your questions, and then you can thumb up questions, and then we'll make sure we get to them. And then Jordan, maybe in the background, you could play the slideshow that we had at the start where we had a little technical issue. But yeah, let's start. Okay, so the first one is for Dr. Field. So what should school boards do to improve climate change education in schools? And can regular people help?
Yes. So I think there's many things. I think, school boards are responsive to what the public is expecting. And I think, schools in general have been quick to, respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and quick change was made around the ways that land acknowledgements happen or Indigenous content is integrated. And for whatever reason, we just haven't had that same leadership in our public education system yet on climate change. So I think there's currently a group in BC of youth that are advocating for curriculum reform, and that's very lofty. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be an entire curriculum reform project. It can be things like requesting, ensuring that purchasing is done according to reduction policies, or ensuring that there is a climate change plan in the school board. And that could be focused on curriculum, it could be focused on operations and facilities. But I think there's various ways. And so I would be asking your trustees those types of questions. And there's things happening all over, and it's not all the same. Like there's hot spots that things are happening. And maybe Kevin, do you want to speak just quickly to the youth group that developed because I don't remember the details, but I think that's an amazing example of what's some of the things that can happen.
I will absolutely shamelessly plug one of our partners. So a great answer. But the Trillium Lakeland School Board, their G7 summit, the students with help from the trustees developed their own climate change plan. We had them at the Watershed Council to present, but it's a very comprehensive plan. So I'd encourage everyone to Google it. I don't want to take too much thunder here, but the Trillium Lakeland School Board, one of our partners, has done a really good job. And I know you're aware of that, Dr. Field. So great answer. Thanks very much.
Can I just add one more thing and then we'll move on?
Yeah.
And I just think that the way that particular project unfolded, the Trillium Lakelands, it allowed for youth to have say over those decisions. They put it forward. And if we're going to talk about like attenuating eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, that's the recipe, is allow for youth to have a direct influence over some of these choices and engage them in a constructive way. We don't have to just say, okay, all youth, you just run all the organizations. We need to be adults and we need to engage them in ways that's reasonable. But I think that is just such an important model. So thanks.
Yeah, no, it's really great. It was totally developed by the students. I think it's wonderful. This one's for Aaron. What do you guys monitor on your properties? We saw that the great maps of all the properties you guys control, and so what do you monitor on those properties?
Yeah, that's a good question. As much as I can, I guess, is the answer. Muskoka Conservancy has 2 staff members, and I'm the one that does all the property monitoring. So with 44 properties, that is quite a lot of stuff that needs to get done sometimes. So I tend to focus on as many properties as I can and focus on specific properties and during specific times. So if we're looking to get a property into the government's tax incentive program so that we don't need to pay property taxes, I focus on looking for species at risk on those properties in June. But if I have a hunch that there's like whippoorwills breeding on a property, I might go at like 10 p.m. one day to look for whippoorwills. So it's it depends on the time of year and depends on what needs to get done. But the biggest key thing is that we're monitoring for human impacts. And I get out to all the properties and make sure people aren't dumping garbage or chopping down trees. You'd be amazed at what you can find in vacant land in Muskoka sometimes. So yeah, human impacts is the biggest one, but I try to monitor as much as I possibly can outside of that.
I think, Aaron, we'll stick with you just because I know a little farther down there's a related question. Are there volunteer opportunities with Conservancy? You mentioned 2 staff people and 44 properties and 2,900 acres is a lot. So is there volunteer opportunities with the Conservancy?
Yeah, so we have volunteers that are land stewards for a number of our properties. And that just basically means instead of me going to every property all the time or as much as I can, we have volunteers who will go out to a specific property and we encourage them to go out. they're required to go out once a year, but we encourage them to go out as much as they want. And they use, like, I've really got into iNaturalist, which is basically a citizen science way to ID things. And I encourage them all to take photos while they're out on the property. I encourage them to go in 4 seasons, like go in the winter, go in the spring. And that way we can grow our species lists on the property and make sure, like, and then I can, you know, focus my energy on things that absolutely need to get done. So there's tons of volunteer opportunities. We have frog and bird surveys that are running right now. So yeah, like, if you want, you can send me an email, or just like, it's all on the website, or info@Muskoka Conservancy is .org is my email. But yeah, there's plenty, especially in the summer months.
That's a great answer. And so I guess this one could go for either, but I'll start with Dr. Field. How can local residents and those concerned help you in your work? What is the role of local government? And I'm not sure if Jane was meaning this for Aaron or for Ellen, but I see it as pertinent to both. So maybe I'll start with Dr. Field.
Local government, so municipalities?
I think the question was more how well, I think it's a two-parter, so it's a bonus. How can local residents and those concerned help you in your work, I guess, would be the first part, sort of your general public. And then what is the role of local government in assisting?
Sure. So I mean, I really see, you know, there's this really interesting model of schools in the UK they're basically community schools. And in it, there would often be shared infrastructure between the government, the local community government, and the school. And because of that shared space, there would then be overlap in terms of sometimes kids would get involved in the decision making. And so I really think, like, I have this sort of vision, this aspirational vision. And, you know, there are schools also in lots of parts of the GTA where there'll be shared physical space between a community center and the school. And I think we just need to be a bit more deliberate about how we engage in local community learning, and where we have the spaces to have students engage in local projects with community organizations. That just brings the expertise of those organizations into the schools, but it also allows students to do action projects. And so we want to move away from organizations sort of coming and doing, you know, their sort of in the bag, or sort of their one activity that just gets rolled over, but instead engage in more meaningful engagement where the kids are helping the organization maybe meet their agendas or their goals. And so there's there's more in-depth community learning. And that can also go not just with community organizations, but wouldn't it be amazing if local government also had a youth representative or a youth advisory council that also was a subcommittee that vetted things and gave reviews? And so I see it as where this, I see that as a maturation of where the youth climate strikes are going. And the youth climate justice movement is a movement to be reckoned with. And the ways that young people today understand the intersectional dimensions of climate change and the ways that they are advocating for reformed systems is going to bring a lot of potential in terms of how those systems adjust. And I think that us as adults, as communities members, we can support young people to, like, raise their voices, but also give them to help them feel confident, because a lot of young people don't feel confident necessarily. It's often that special teacher or that engaged grandparent who helps them recognize that they have a voice and it needs to be heard. So
that's, yeah, no, I agree. And Aaron, maybe because I see there's two questions in a row here that are both about protection and how you guys protect property. So I guess Karen asks, what do you mean by protected? And then how do you go about protecting properties and land trusts? I know you mentioned making sure there's not human interference or maybe illegal trails or dumping, but is there a process that you go through?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I mean by protected is safe from development is maybe the easiest way to put it. Like, we're not developing the property. If someone donates land to us, we're kind of leaving it as is or managing as needed. And the managing as needed is like making sure people aren't cutting down trees, but also making sure invasive species aren't encroaching on the wetland or things like that. So protected really is safe from development. It's not going to get developed. It's going to stay in the current natural state, or as close as possible. And how we go about protecting properties, that's a lot of like residents getting involved. So we have a number of our properties that there's a 100-acre section along their lake that people love keeping natural, and they don't want that to get developed. So we've had fundraisers by them. Cottagers have raised money to protect a section of the lake. Had concerned neighbors of there's a field that we're working on with some neighbors who were really interested in protecting the bobolinks and meadowlarks that bred there, and they fundraised and made that acquisition possible. So we work with community groups and groups of concerned citizens all the time, working to protect properties.
That's great, and we've got. I want to make sure we can capture the people that don't have that aren't on their computer, they're on their phone. So I've got two quick, one for Aaron and then one for Dr. Field. Aaron, very quickly, one of the questions was, you're obviously a charitable organization, but if you donate land or money to the land trust, is that tax deductible? I know that's a very quick one, but it's probably pretty important for people.
Yeah, it's so you get a charitable tax receipt for it, for any donations of land or money or securities. The interesting thing, I guess, is if you're doing a conservation easement where the private landowner maintains ownership of their land and they're just putting a protected area onto it, the tax receipt is the difference in the value of the maximum amount. So there's an appraisal process which appraises what the maximum amount the property might be worth and its current value, with it like remaining natural. But yes, all donations do have tax receipts to them.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Dr. Field, I know we looked a little bit at climate change visualization and types of messaging, burning something versus like helping something. In general, and I know this is a broad question, but I thought it was a good one. What is the most effective approach to communicate climate change? I guess we'll say to students or just in general to people. Is it positive? Is it the half burning, half helping? I know it's a tough question, but.
So in general, especially with young people and with the kinds of reporting we have, the images that we have in the news, you can't blue sky, you can't positive spin climate change completely. And young people also deserve to be told honestly. However, there's a developmental appropriateness that goes with that. So, with kindergarten students, I wouldn't recommend necessarily talking about some aspects of it. I would let students ask the questions, and then you respond based on the kinds of frames and language that they're using. But in terms of, it's so contextual, so it's hard, like in a school setting versus a sort of NGO setting. But in general, people need to feel that they have some control in order to make change. And so there's lots of really powerful research that shows how solar panels being put into a neighborhood, all of a sudden the solar panel, everyone else in the neighborhood starts to adopt that. And so it's those actionable, smaller pieces that are really important for people to be able to engage with and take on. It's when images or messaging make it seem insurmountable and out of people's ability to enact change, that generally they turn off.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. I do notice that we're getting really close, very close to our time. And so I'm gonna stop questions there, because I know John has a little bit of a wrap up. But I wanted to first thank you, Aaron, as well as Dr. Field, for just what is a really incredible talk with a ton of information and a lot of interest. And I know it was a beautiful day, so thank you very much to all of our audience who stuck with it. It's still sunny out there. In 5 minutes, you can go out and catch some vitamin D. But without further ado, I will thank you, speakers, thank all our guests, and I'll turn it over to John for closing thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. And thank you to Dr. Ellen Field and Aaron Rusak for your presentation tonight. It was awesome. I'd also like to thank Kevin and Jordan and Ann Curley behind the scenes for helping us administrate our series. And I'd also like to thank Green Rock Capital Partners for their sponsorship of this entire series. Very generous of them. The fourth event is a week tonight, May 13th, 5 p.m. Please join us as we welcome Dr. Peter Sale and Dr. Richard Lammers to talk about climate change. Is it really such a big deal for Muskoka? We had a small technical glitch, as you might have noticed today. I could see my slides just perfectly, but apparently no one else could. So I hope you had a chance to take a look at them while Q&A was going on. The sun is shining, so please have a good evening, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you. We'll see you next week.